I'm Nicholas Thompson. You're listening to The Most Interesting Thing in AI, a podcast produced by Atlantic Rethink, the Atlantic's creative marketing studio, in collaboration with PwC, a leader in helping organizations use AI. In each episode, we're exploring how artificial intelligence is reshaping our lives and redefining what's possible. So the rise of generative AI has been met with anxiety by a lot of artists, right? You can go into one of these large language models and you can have it write a song with a 6-word prompt. You can have it create an image in the style of Caravaggio or Vermeer. It's kind of unsettling if you make your living making art. I used to be a musician, played acoustic guitar. I often wonder if I were still doing that, how would I feel about using AI to enhance my art? How would I feel about using AI to create music from scratch? It's a pretty uncomfortable question. Because of this, I'm really excited to talk today with Sougwen Chung, one of the artists who's been using AI for a long time, incredibly interesting ways. Back in 2013, they scanned 20 years of their drawings, taught a robot how to draw like them, and they would perform on stage together with the robot, accentuating both what AI could do, but also some of the imperfections. And since then, Sougwen's inventions have become ever more elaborate, ever more interesting, ever more complicated. But it's never just to sort of make an example of a cool robot or show that AI art can be done. It's to actually try to get at the very interesting question of, as Sougwen says, where does AI end and we begin? What is the creativity that comes from us? What can you see within AI? There's always a physical nature to Sougwen's art as they perform with the machine. It's a truly remarkable thing. And so we go pretty deep in this conversation. I learned a lot. I hope you enjoy it, and I hope you listen through. Sougwen, it's such a pleasure to meet you. You do remarkably interesting work.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be in conversation with you too.
Let's start a little bit with your background. So you have these parents who, in a wonderful inversion of gender stereotypes, your father is the opera singer and your mother's a computer coder. Tell me about their influences on you.
I love that you bring up the gender inversion of that, because I really feel like that has shaped a lot of how I see those types of stereotypes. I have to really give a lot of credit to my mother and father. I think because of them, I had access to two very fundamental ingredients in making up my worldview, which is access to technology and access to and an interest in a creative vocabulary from a very young age. Thinking about things like instruments like violin and piano, and thinking of things like computers and technology, both malleable substances for my own exploration, expression, and vision. They're quite opposite in a way. I hope they're okay with me saying this. But they're quite opposite in a lot of ways. And I was really interested in bringing those types of opposites together, music and computation, science and art, and sort of reconciling some of the contradictions that come from working in something really technical and then working in something that's really kind of creative and that shapes a cultural landscape in a certain way.
And that means that you were never just an artist or just an engineer. You were always both.
Exactly. And I felt really confident in saying that from a really young age. I think a lot of times there is a little bit of imposter syndrome when working as an engineer, exploring creative fields. It's like, oh, I'm not a real artist, I'm too technical. And then vice versa. I think artists sometimes feel like they don't have enough ownership or grasp over technical systems to be able to really call themselves an engineer. And I feel like that's really an unnecessary divide. We're all growing in our disciplines, and I sort of see artists and engineers as one and the same. Oftentimes, they're incredibly discipline specific. And that is one thing I've become really interested in, being in the space of AI systems and these new tools that are emerging. There's a lot of co-piloting, there's a lot of assistance that can really blur those lines of identity as an artist, identity as an engineer. The pathway to creative expression, technical expression, and technical expertise, that threshold has become a lot lower. And I think that's quite exciting. I think the most prolific engineers have a very artistic sensibility to them. Definitely some of the engineers I've worked with consider their practices in engineering really artful, and they see the poetry of what they do. And same with the artists of the present day and also of the past. Painters have used and built different apparatuses for measuring light, for capturing light in a certain way. You can't tell me that's not a feat of engineering as it is a feat of artistry. It's an interesting space to think about.
So tell me a little bit. We're on a podcast. People
Yeah.
can't see anything. They hear you, they hear me.
Yeah.
Describe specifically and visually your
Mhm.
first AI art project, and then maybe jump ahead and describe specifically and visually your most recent one so that everybody listening can say, oh, I know what this is.
This is going to date me, but I was working with this concept and these systems before it was even really called AI. The language and the vocabulary around this technology was really focused on machine learning, deep learning, and neural networks. So it was around 2014, 2015. I remember my first performance with Doug 1, Drawing Operations Unit Generation 1, very fondly. I became really interested in, while working as a researcher at Media Lab, moving the creative process from the screen back into physical space. So I built a very small tabletop robot, about 30 centimeters by 30 centimeters by 30 centimeters, limited range of motion. And I programmed the robot through an overhead camera to track the color red. And I put that color red on the edge of my pencil. So when I would move my pencil to the left, it would move to the right. So it became this interesting inversion. But what I really found interesting about it is that it happened in real time. And it happened in a way that felt simultaneous. And it became this really hypnotic kind of not choreographed, this series of gestures, like an interesting game of mimicry. The theme of that generation was mimicry. And even though it was a really simplistic system, I really found it interesting that you can program a computer to have a very reductive sense of vision, to just see red and follow that line. So in my mind, it was going to be this beautifully hypnotic drawing unfolding. And the reality was a lot different. It was really, really clunky, and it was kind of moving in ways that I wasn't expecting because, without getting too much into the details, you need to program your kinematics of the robot really elegantly in order for it to have a really fluid motion. And I was not that kind of engineer at that time. So it became this really clunky, uncanny robot that I kind of struggled to draw with. And then I was performing that in space, really bringing a lot of the inaccuracies to the table. But then those inaccuracies became strangely hypnotic in their own way. Sort of like the failure states, the glitch in the machine became this really provocative subject for the audience. For me, upon reflection, right after the performance, I was like, well, that was really interesting as a performer. It felt like I was performing with a version of me, but also different somehow. But from an audience perspective, it was, here you are seeing this broken machine or a very rudimentary machine, but people are bringing so much of their emotion to the table, so much of their weird aspiration, so much curiosity about how things worked. So that became a real motivator for me to explore this strange genre.
So you're in a room, you're drawing, and the machine is drawing the mirror image of what you're drawing, but it's doing it somewhat inaccurately. And
Yeah.
then there's something emotional about it. If you had just set up a machine to draw randomly, or a machine to draw what you had drawn yesterday, it's much less exciting for the audience than the fact that it's trying to copy you, but it can't quite.
Exactly. And interestingly, as I'm there in space in real time, I am also trying to adapt my own gesture to create a more aesthetic image. And I'm kind of becoming a little bit more machine-like by trying to have the system read my line in a more logical way. And all of this is happening at the level of intuition because we're in the space of performance now and we're just trying to feed back on each other. And some people are really bring so much emotion to the table, anthropomorphizing the robot, thinking that maybe I'm losing my mind by allowing this to happen in performance, wondering if this is intentional, wondering if it's not. It was really, really fascinating because I've worked in interactive media for a few years at that point, and I'd never had that kind of emotional reaction, that kind of conversation that came after. And I was really inspired by the level of empathy that people brought to the space. Really like, is the robot okay? And
Yeah.
so it's such a human and kind of really beautiful and dare I say sweet thing that people were bringing to this strange interaction. And this is before AI was really a term in the public consciousness. It was before so many of the advances in technology that shape our world today. It was just this really simple interaction, not just between me and the system, not just between me and Doug, but between me and the audience.
Okay. So then we'll jump ahead. We get Doug 2, Doug 3, Doug 4, Doug 5. Jump ahead to where your art is now in your most recent project.
To today, 2024, almost 10 years later, actually, which has been a really wild decade of this type of exploration. I recently finished a performance with the Doug 5 at the V&A in London. I designed a system that's linked to my own brainwave data. So much about what I'm interested in exploring is what becomes of the human hand when intertwined with these machine systems. And the pandemic really made me question if drawing even needed to be done with the hand, if we could catalyze different types of movement to create drawn marks. So in the performance, I meditate with the brainwave EEG headset for 2 minutes in front of an audience. And from that brainwave data, I do a 20-minute painting with these two much larger now robotic units, about 1.5 meters by 1.5 meters to either side. And it's a really different interaction. It's because they're similar to me in scale. There is a simultaneity, but there's also the sense of them really being a formidable arm. I think the idea that a robotic arm has a historical legacy in industrial manufacturing comes into play. They're almost larger than me in scale. And through working with the sense of stillness through meditation and my brainwave data, we paint together.
And explain the differences, right? So one thing that's different is brainwave data is much more intimate. It's actually
Yeah.
inside your brain. But it's also less understandable, right? You could give me two
Yeah.
printouts, one of which is my brainwave data, and another is like a visualization of rainfall in the Adirondacks. And I would have no idea which one is which. Like we have no idea, or I have no idea what brainwave data means. Explain that dynamic where it's both extremely intimate, but also harder to comprehend.
That's actually a really great question. I don't think I get asked that too often, but it really dials into what's special about the system. So there are different kind of categories of brainwave data, right? So what's the difference between a random sound wave and your brainwave data, right? The graphs look the same. What's different is I was reading a research paper during the pandemic that said when you're in a heightened state of meditation, a heightened state of creative flow, your alpha brainwave spikes. And that becomes this interesting way of controlling your own proprioception, controlling your own inner electricity, if you would. And that spike makes the brainwave data unique to the system and it makes it this usable data. So we created a trigger point with the heightened alpha wave that I need to manifest in myself in order to work with this robotic system. And I was doing a talk recently and someone came up to me afterwards and they're like, so Gwen, what I realized, apart from being interested in your practice, is you're a real nerd. I recognize that this is a kind of nerdy stuff, but I fall in love with the engineering of it. I fall in love with the data science of the project. So that heightened spike of creative flow became not just a creative challenge, but a physical challenge for me in working with the system.
So you mean the robots will not draw unless you
Yeah.
can reach this very intense meditative state?
Exactly. Which I think brings a lot to the space of performance. What I loved about being a musician and being shaped by musical language, and what's interesting to me about watching performance is there's something at stake. There's something that is really tied to the performer's expertise that I think is sometimes missing in a lot of these interactive media projects and AI projects, if you would. It's just like random fluid simulations and a lot of randomness that you say is one thing but could be anything. And I love that I had to really bring a sense of risk in my own body, honestly, and my own concentration to the table.
I like that a lot. So when you started, nobody was doing collaborations to make art with AI.
Absolutely nobody. Yeah.
And now lots of people are.
Yeah,
But one
yeah.
of the distinctions you're making is it sounds like you appreciate the AI art that connects to humans in a real way and
Yeah,
that
yeah.
isn't just AI wave hands art attach the two.
I think the reason why I think this way is because it goes down to that first performance where I felt in that moment that there was something real. There's something real about the empathy that the audience gave to the project, and it wasn't about making the perfect image. If you made a perfect image, I think people would just, shrug their shoulders and be like, that's a weird project and walk away. But I think when you bring something really human and true into the space of human and machine collaboration, and what's true about it is the creative risk, the meditative signal, the expressive line, the error state even, right? That things kind of mess up sometimes. I think so much more becomes unlocked philosophically, technically, artistically, in terms of one's attention, culturally. That becomes really more of the interesting moment of reflection versus will we be replaced? How perfect is the machine going to be? I think that has a very limited scope in terms of what it can do to inspire and intrigue.
So interesting. All right, let's go back a minute and talk about creativity. Did Doug 1 or Doug 5, did they ever do something that you stopped and said, wow, that's truly creative?
I find that there's nothing about the systems that I work with that produce expected results for me. It's always improvisational and it's always the interpretation of my original line. It has to see my original line before the system can make decisions about what line should come next. That's how the system works. It's always linked to me. I think what's always the most creative is how we adapt to these novel systems. I think it's an interesting thing about working with art. It could be argued, even before AI came into focus as it is now, that painting is dead. There's no more original painting, there's no more original image. We had those thoughts in the Andy Warhol days, right? Like everything is mass produced, cultural meaning and image making is already in dire straits. But really, it's our adaptation to these AI systems that does so much of the heavy lifting for me creatively and conceptually. I often think that our idea of creativity is so subjective that the benchmark for whether AI can be creative is really difficult to gauge because I would argue that an elephant painting can be creative and you would say, no, that's not creative at all. I think it's more about what we can do together and how it shapes our very thinking about creativity that is the point that's quite rife for me for exploration. I've said that perhaps the future of creativity isn't in AI or humans alone, but it's how we come together to form new ways of making, which is new ways of engaging with machines and new ways of engaging with the world around us to create these entanglements, if you would.
Well, I'm going to stand by almost all elephant paintings are shockingly creative. I'll take that hard position while we're here.
Yeah.
Have you ever had a moment where a system that you've built and
Mm.
trained on your own data has done something better than you could have done it?
You know what? Honestly, all the time. I think especially working in more of a digital realm, right? So I work in a lot of different media. I work in sculpture, I work in painting and drawing and sort of the digital moving image as well. And I think so often, again, especially on the digital canvas, it's sort of the machine's home turf, right? Within the simulation, that's where these systems are really meant to shine. The, native to machine language, right? We see anything on a screen through code. That's just it. And I think that's part of the point of it. It's that for me, it's been a way to move past the simulation of the digital and back into the space of embodiment. For me, everything happens for real in physical space. I think so much of the fragility of resources, human connection, tactility happens in a space where we interact physically as people, right? And I think that's where a lot of the truth is. There's something about bringing it back into the space of the physical and the tangible that the AI generated images really encourages me to do.
I'm having this image, one of those, old Renaissance studios where you have these people working for you and they're churning out art that is like yours or that you've directed, but it's not you. So Sougwen is never going to have a shop, a barn full of robots, like churning out paintings that you then sign your name on the bottom and sell.
There's people that do that for sure. For me, I think of paintings in maybe a bit of an unusual way because I have a background as a musician, but I think of a painting as a record of time spent, an artifact of this process. So I kind of have to be there. It's not for me
Hmm.
about the image, it's about the interaction.
Right.
And that interaction creates an artifact that connects me with an audience, it connects me with another person who ends up taking that canvas or whatnot. And that's the interesting thread for me that comes through. Mass produced art is not new. We've had machines and robots to do that for a very long time. I'm interested in my own change being recorded
Yeah.
in the process.
And if I look at the different Dougs and the different models you built, it seems like there's a linear progression of complexity and intricacy. Was there ever one you built and abandoned that the world hasn't seen? And if so, why? Like, did you ever try to build an AI collaborative tool and then ditch it because it wasn't giving you what you wanted?
Yes, actually. I think I've thought a lot about the ethics of the data set. And for a long time I was really interested in like working with artistic data of artists that have passed away as an homage, like Hilma
Yeah.
af Klint. I'm going to make a Hilma af Klint Doug or Hilma af Klint training model and really try to bring this and think about collaboration in that way. But then I think those models really for me, bristled at my own creative ethics, thinking about consent, and sort of thinking about where real artistry comes from. And I don't think you can create a real approximation of Hilma af Klint or any painter through data, especially in the way that I would be interacting with public archives. It felt like a regressive direction to go with designing a system. And that's part of what this 10-year exploration has been, you know, what really resonates, what really continues to satisfy my curiosity of how these systems work. And yeah, there've been a lot of things that I've left on the table because it's not really what I want to highlight in the system. There's a lot of gimmicks, there's a lot of trickery that is a real distraction from the really beautiful and interesting and profound things that we can make with these tools.
So now you've moved beyond just working with different versions of human hands. You've also started working with live creatures and silkworms.
Yeah, yeah.
Tell me a little bit about how your art is going to evolve in the years to come.
Oh, I don't know if we even have so much enough time to get into all of it, but I'm really excited about this new direction. I think the short version is after working with building these systems for the past 10 years, I realized that a machine is just an invention. This idea that a robot is something that we've invented as human beings, and it can be anything. It doesn't necessarily need to be a particular form. It doesn't really need to be made of the ingredients that we think it needs to be made of, metal, aluminum, and silicone. It can be made out of biomaterial. It can be made out of something that is much more organic and something that has a limited shelf life. We can make circuits out of silkworm fibroin. And I think that's really beautiful. So I've been rearing these silkworms in my studio to produce the silk protein that we can run electrical current through. We're in its really early stages, but I love this idea. And this is all grounded in research, extraplanetary research that's done in space stations. But really thinking about this evolution of the silkworm as something that can be brought back into not only the space of care, as I have to learn how to take care of these little creatures, but also something that can be used to program and complicate our idea of what a machine is and what life can be.
Explain how this comes about from space station research.
So, the history of the silkworm has been really intertwined with human evolution. I think the short version is scientists and researchers are already using silk protein to design circuits that actually can be embedded into skin. And that has been applied mostly in the field of extraplanetary exploration. It's sort of coming from a field where they've had to think about novel use cases for machines. And we're kind of bringing it into the space. And again, it's not to make a painting. I'm not even sure what it's going to do yet. But I think this idea that you can create a machine that's more linked to the organic and the human system is something that I'm really exploring in forthcoming generations of the project.
Wait, so are you making a new kind of machine or are you making a new kind of animal?
Good question. In my mind, it's really linked to a new kind of machine. There's a researcher called Michael Levin that I've been fascinated by, who's created a really interesting type of machine called the xenobot, which is built out of frog cells and frog embryos. They're really, really rudimentary, but for me, I'm actually looking at it as a new type of machine, an organic machine, a living machine. I bring so much life to my robotic systems that I want to take that one step further and think about what a living machine might be and what that could look like. And it's pretty radical. Sometimes I feel a little bit like Frankenstein in a lab, but I do think there's a lot of potential in new research in bioengineering and bioelectricity to support this idea that the very nature of a machine can be a change agent.
Now I think I understand your work a little better than I did before we started talking. A lot of people think that the process of bringing AI into art is the process of bringing life out of the art, right? But you don't do that. In fact, it's sort of the opposite. You do all your art with the machine, and now, in fact, you're trying to bring a new form of life into the art. So you're kind of actually using AI in art, but in the opposite way from so much of the rest of the world.
I guess I am. I've actually, I have to say, Nick, I've not thought of it that way, in that kind of opposite to everyone else. But I do think there's something really different about my view of human agency in these systems. It's always about making sure that the human hand is always present, that I'm always there in the work, that human life is always there. And I think through that, we've raised really interesting philosophical questions about what that even means, right? And I think that line is always shifting and moving. In the performances, just did one like 2 weeks ago, so it's quite fresh in my mind. I'm bringing life to the system. I'm bringing my creative energy, my creative data, my biosignal into this interaction. So that's the sort of the opposite of this reductive aspect of using our data to train these models, right? I'm like trying to really push the meaning behind what that translation is and ask some questions along the way.
Well, we started with your parents' inversion of gender stereotypes. We're ending with your inversion of AI artist stereotypes. Let me ask you one last question, which is, what is one thing you hope to see happen with AI in the next year?
I really hope that people realize that curiosity and criticality in AI systems really need each other. So I think we swing too much towards the other way, just curiosity without any repercussions, without any ability to sit with the darker use cases, right? Or we think it's just dark, it's just exploitative, and that's not true either. And I feel there's this new wave of artists, of people, of writers, of researchers that really understand the necessity of both, because that's how we build more equitable systems, more ethical systems, more interesting systems, right? So I think that's coming, and that's going to be a big sigh of relief for everyone, and I'm excited to be a part of it.
Wonderful. All right. Thank you so much, Sougwen. It was an absolute pleasure to have you on.
A pleasure speaking with you, Nick.
That was my conversation with Sougwen Chung. This episode concludes the first season of The Most Interesting Thing in AI. I hope you've enjoyed hearing from some of the brightest minds and thinkers in the world of AI. It's easy to feel overwhelmed by hype and pronouncements surrounding the technology, but don't let that distract you from the extraordinary potential. A 20-year-old who loaded up a Netscape browser in the summer of 1995 couldn't have predicted all the ways the internet would change society. They just sensed that they were looking at the future. And I have the same feeling about AI. We know it's going to change how we work, how we educate ourselves, how we live, but we don't know how that path will unfold. That's why the conversations like the ones in this podcast matter so much. It's a moment where we try to understand how this technology works and how we can guide it responsibly. There are going to be a lot of stumbles along the way, but my hope is that we can build a human-centered AI that does a lot of good. This series was produced by Wonder Media Network and Atlantic Rethink, the Atlantic's creative marketing studio, in collaboration with PwC. I'm Nicholas Thompson, and you've been listening to The Most Interesting Thing in AI.